Hey, welcome Social 9. Today we are going to look at the supply side of the supply and demand aspect of the market economy. Last day we looked at demand curves. You did some practice questions. Hopefully you've gotten those into me. If not, you can use Flipgrid to submit your video questions. But get those questions in so I can see your understanding. We're going to skip the practice questions on the supply side. You've been through all this now, so this slideshow, despite being as long as the last one, we're going to fly through a little bit faster here today. So let's get right into it. If we are talking about supply, supply is the quantity of goods a business is willing and able to sell at various prices. Note some of the keyword differences here between supply and demand, and note the words that are very, very similar here. So again, supply is the quantity of goods a business is both willing and able to sell at various prices. And that means, just like we have a law of demand, we also have a law of supply. The law of supply says that as prices increase, the quantity supplied or willing to be supplied will increase. And similarly, as prices decrease, the quantity will decrease. Now, if we were in class, normally this is where some car junkie would raise their hand and be like, oh, but we have to talk about Ferraris because they are super, super expensive. Yet even, as Enzo Ferrari was crafting them by hand, that didn't increase what he was doing. And so I need to just maybe pause and say luxury items, especially if they're handcrafted, don't follow this quite the same, but the general rule still holds even for them, right? I mean, it's just that the initial curve is going to be closer to the left than it otherwise would be. So high-end items still follow the law of supply. It's just that their curve starts diminished compared to something like a roll of toilet paper. All right, so we've dealt with your Ferrari aside. I think we all know which of our grade 9 students would be asking about cars right now. Let's keep moving here. And there is our lovely mathematical equation for you as well. All right, so if we take a look, supply graph, very basic. There's your price on the y-axis, the quantity on the x-axis. And you'll notice here that this angles up. Yes, supply goes up in a supply and demand graph. And the reason we do that, well, maybe we should emphasize the up here. There is Superman to help us out. It's always going to go up because the higher the price of something, the more quantity that the business is likely to produce. Again, if this was a demand graph, it goes down because if the price goes up, consumers are less inclined to buy it. So they are opposite in their approach. So again, supply always up in this case. Just like before, we have ourselves a schedule or a chart here, and our supply schedule is going to be very, very similar. So here, though, you'll notice that the quantity supplied will be inverted compared to our demand schedule from before. And so the only true similarity that we'll get in this number is the 6 and the 3, $6, 3 quantity. That will be identical to the demand schedule, and that'll create something called equilibrium, which we'll talk about another day here. We've already talked about a little bit, but the rest will be flipped or inverted. And as always, we take this chart, this supply schedule, and we turn that into a graph. So if we want to see how much of a certain good a producer is going to make, we look at the price, we line it up to the quantity, and there we go. So point A here at $10, the quantity supplied is 5 in this example. All right. So price changes are, of course, just like on the demand graphs, going to follow the slope, right? They can't leave the slope. They have to stay on it. So we're not going to get some a weird thing where at $4, the quantity they'll want to produce will be 9,000 or something like that. It always follows the slope here. But again, the slope can move its location. And so there is the target. So we see when the price is lowered to $8, the distributor, the supplier, the manufacturer doesn't want to produce as much because it's less profitable for them. Okay, so there's movement along the supply curve. Now, as we get some changes here, changes in the price can cause a change in the quantity supplied. And so we'll move the supply curve around as we go here. Again, if businesses are, if the supply curve is shifting, if it's moving, that means businesses are willing and able to sell more of a good at every single price level. If it decreases, it means businesses are willing and able to sell less of a good at every price level. This goes back to our Ferrari example, where it would be a decreased graph compared to other automobiles with respect to supply, because they're not able to sell as many. They weren't able to produce as many. So it's not just the willingness, it's the ability that factors in here as well. And again, we'll shift the entire supply curve as we go. And so if we increase it, the curve will be moved over to the right. Again, at every price point, there is an increase in quantity that the producer is able to manufacture, whether it's the lowest price points or the highest price points. And in a decrease, we'll see the shift over to the left on the graph, where they are not willing or not able to produce as many of the item in question. So there's a whole bunch of reasons that we see supply shifts, and we'll talk about most of those here. The first is the technology and the productivity, GNS meaning goods and services. You'll notice, again, sticking with the car theme here, that one of the things that changed historically, we'll talk about this in Social 30, is and grade 10, I think you'll probably learn about, is the idea of automation. So as new technology improves production, as production is more cheaply, occurring, then we'll get more productivity, more efficiency, and we'll see the supply curve shift to the right. Now, the inputs are all of the items necessary to manufacture something. So in the event of, clothing or textiles, the cost of cotton is going to dictate how expensive it is to produce, the t-shirt you're wearing, for instance. So if that cost increases, the supply will decrease. It's cutting into the margins, it's cutting into the profits of the business. It's more expensive to make the good. Similarly, though, if one of those factors of production or inputs decreases, then the supply will increase because it's less expensive to produce the good. There's more profit motive, more incentive to manufacture it. There's cotton swabs for you, and there is your t-shirt. All right. Let's talk about expectations. We talked about expectations at length when we were looking at the demand side. And similar to consumers, the supplier is also thinking about the future. If a producer expects they can sell a good for a higher price in the near future, they'll increase the supply right now. And similarly, if they expect that it'll be a lower price in the future, they'll cut their supply immediately. Again, the best example I can give you today is this idea of our oil and gas. One of the brands of oil, if you will, that we as Albertans sell is called Western Canadian Select, and it's trading anywhere from $5 to $10 a barrel right now. We expect that we'll see that trend continue, and so you can expect that people in the oil industry supplying Western Canadian Select which has a high input, we'll expect that they will continue to cut their supply right now. Pumpkins at Halloween in particular, but certainly through American Thanksgiving, will see an increase in price. It's almost gouging at times how expensive they are. And so you'll see pumpkins, show up the very beginning of October and sometimes even into September. They want those pumpkins ready. They want people thinking about pumpkins. They want people buying pumpkins. And so suppliers want to make sure those pumpkins are there. All right. Government, of course, this is when we talk about this shift left, shift right idea. A government that increases its regulations economically is shifting left. That typically decreases the supply chain. A government that shifts right in economic speak is, in fact, going to help increase the supply. So it's kind of weird because we use this phrase shift left, shift right to talk about economic systems moving, but they're actually opposite effects because a government shift left will actually change the supply, right? The supply will go down versus up when there's a decrease. So it's this weird inverted relationship. So when I talk shift left of a government system, that means more government involvement, more regulations, more taxes. When I talk about shift right of a government, I'm talking about decreased taxes, fewer regulations. When I'm talking about shift left or shift right on one of these charts, I'm literally just talking about you moving the curve left or right. Now, government can also subsidize as farmers. Some of you may have benefited from government subsidies to help increase the supply. Government will pay money to, kind of shelter you from a bad growing season or from a poor market. So sometimes subsidies are something we see, and typically these subsidies are aimed at agriculture, but we've seen subsidies to the automobile industry. We've seen subsidies into media recently. All the main media companies got funding. So subsidies can apply to any industry, but historically we tend to think about farm subsidies. I think even our current government federally under the Prime Minister has had some subsidies going to farmers as there was a trade war with the United States. Related goods can affect the supply as well here. And so perhaps the best example is the switch from VHS to DVD, DVD to Blu-ray. Here we'll see production will shift from a good that is not selling well into a good that is profitable, that is regularly selling, whatever. What I'm saying is that if you want to go buy a brand new VHS player right now, or even a brand new DVD player, you are going to struggle to find companies that are doing that. Certainly, they still exist, but they don't have a huge supply curve. You want to find a Blu-ray player, though, you have a whole host of options available to you. Finally, let's talk about weather and natural disasters. Of course, bad weather can decrease our supply, particularly of our inputs that are agriculturally based. And good weather, a good growing season, can decrease these things. Similarly, natural disasters can influence things like the oil industry, right? We saw the Fort McMurray wildfires were negatively impacting Alberta's oil production. So weather and natural disasters can also affect the supply curve. You've had your chance now to learn about supply and demand individually. I am going to have you graph a whole boatload of things just to see if it's stuck in your noggin. And then we'll get to equilibrium as our last part on this supply and demand set of lessons that we do. And hey, I hope you're paying attention to some of these triggers for changes as well, because coming up, I've got a contest that I've entered you in against Forestburg School that is going to have you battle it out creating a product. And certainly you'll need to be able to think about and apply your knowledge of supply and demand. So be ready for that. Hey, if you have any questions, grade 9, you've got the email, you have office hours, take advantage. That's all I've got for now. See you.